Finally, this show is being canceled. Those were the words that echoed through Studio 58 last night as Harrison Ford delivered what might be the most explosive moment in late show history. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because you're not going to believe what unfolds. What started as a seemingly standard celebrity appearance quickly devolved into television chaos that had crew members scrambling and producers frantically signaling from the wings. The tension was palpable from the moment Ford walked onto the set. Stephen Colbert, notorious for his increasingly confrontational interview style, seemed determined to push every button he could find. The veteran actor, promoting his latest project, appeared visibly uncomfortable as Colbert launched into what can only be described as an ambush rather than an interview. "So, Harrison, you're here promoting another sequel nobody asked for." Colbert opened with his trademark smirk, completely bypassing any pleasantries. "Tell me, at what point do you think audiences get tired of watching you phone it in?" The studio audience shifted uncomfortably as Ford's expression darkened. This wasn't the playful banter viewers had come to expect. This was something far more sinister. Ford, maintaining his composure despite the obvious provocation, responded with measured restraint. "Well, Stephen, I think audiences appreciate authenticity, something that seems to be in short supply these days." The subtle dig wasn't lost on anyone, least of all Colbert, whose jaw visibly tightened. The host leaned back in his chair, that familiar predatory gleam in his eyes that regular viewers know all too well. Authenticity? That's rich, coming from someone who's been coasting on the same three characters for 40 years. Colbert shot back, his voice dripping with disdain. "Han Solo, Indiana Jones, and Grumpy Old Man. Which one are you playing tonight?" The audience's nervous laughter couldn't mask the growing hostility radiating from the interview desk. Ford's legendary cool began showing cracks as he leaned forward slightly. "You know, Stephen, I've been doing interviews longer than you've been in show business. I've sat across from professionals who understand the difference between humor and harassment." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and everyone in the studio knew they had just witnessed the first real shot fired in what was about to become an all-out war. Colbert's response was swift and merciless. "Oh, I'm sorry. Did I hurt the feelings of the man who wanted his own character killed off because he was tired of pretending to care about the fans?" The reference to Ford's well-documented frustration with the Star Wars franchise was a low blow, and the actor's face flushed with anger. "Maybe if you put half as much effort into your performances as you do into your complaints, we wouldn't be sitting here watching you desperately try to stay relevant." The studio fell silent, except for the uncomfortable shifting of audience members, who were beginning to realize they were witnessing something unprecedented. Ford's hands gripped the arms of his chair as he processed what had just been said to him on national television. This wasn't the playful roasting that celebrities typically signed up for. This was character assassination disguised as entertainment. "Stay relevant?" Ford's voice carried a dangerous edge that made several crew members exchange worried glances. "I was making movies when you were still figuring out how to read cue cards without moving your lips. The difference between us, Stephen, is that I've earned my place in this industry through decades of work, not by hiding behind a desk making cheap shots at people who actually create something meaningful." Colbert's laugh was harsh and mocking. "Meaningful? You mean like Crystal Skull? Or how about that disaster Cowboys and Aliens? Face it, Harrison. You're yesterday's news desperately clinging to past glory." The host was clearly enjoying himself, feeding off the discomfort he was creating. "At least, when I bomb, I don't take an entire franchise down with me." The personal nature of the attacks was becoming impossible to ignore. Ford had endured decades of interviews, faced down difficult journalists and hostile critics, but this felt different. This felt calculated and cruel in a way that transcended professional disagreement and entered the realm of pure malice. "You know what your problem is, Stephen?" Ford's voice grew quieter, more controlled, which somehow made it more menacing. "You've confused cruelty with cleverness. You think tearing people down makes you important? But all it does is reveal how small you really are." The words struck home, and for a brief moment Colbert's mask slipped, revealing something ugly underneath. But rather than backing down, The host doubled down on his aggression. Small? I'm not the one who looks like he'd rather be anywhere else every time someone puts a camera on him. Tell me, Harrison, when exactly did you give up caring about your craft? Was it after the third Indiana Jones movie? Or did it take until Kingdom of the Crystal Skull for you to completely phone it in? The systematic demolition of Ford's career and reputation was painful to watch. Audience members began looking around nervously, some pulling out their phones to capture what was clearly becoming a historic television moment. The actor's legendary composure was being tested in ways no publicist could have prepared him for. Ford sat back in his chair, a look of disgust spreading across his weathered features. This is exactly what I'm talking about. This isn't entertainment, Stephen. This isn't even journalism. This is just you getting your kicks by being cruel to people who can't fight back without looking like the bad guy. His voice carried the weight of someone who had finally seen enough. Can't fight back? Colbert leaned forward aggressively. You're Harrison Ford. You've got more money and influence than I'll ever have. If you can't handle a few questions, maybe you should stick to movies where they can edit out your personality. The cruelty was becoming more blatant with each exchange, and it was clear that something irreversible was building between these two men. The atmosphere in the studio had shifted from uncomfortable to genuinely tense. Security personnel moved closer to the stage area, and producers in the control room were frantically debating whether to cut to commercial. Ford's jaw was set in a way that anyone who had watched his movies would recognize. This was a man reaching his breaking point. A few questions? Ford's laugh was bitter and cold. Is that what you call this character assassination masquerading as comedy? You know, I came here to talk about my work, not to be your personal punching bag for whatever issues you're working through. The professional facade was crumbling, revealing the genuine anger underneath. What happened next would change everything, and the tremor in Colbert's voice suggested he knew he had pushed too far. But instead of backing down, Colbert made the fatal mistake of doubling down on his aggression. You know what, Harrison? Maybe the real problem isn't the questions I'm asking. Maybe the real problem is that you can't handle the truth about your career. The host's voice took on a sneering quality that made everyone in the studio wince. You're sitting here acting like some wounded legend, but the reality is, you've been coasting for decades on the goodwill of fans who still remember when you actually gave a damn. Ford's eyes flashed with something dangerous. The careful composure he'd maintained throughout his career was finally cracking under the relentless assault. The truth about my career? You want to talk about truth? His voice rose slightly, just enough to make the audience hold their collective breath. The truth is, I've spent 40 years creating characters that mean something to people. Characters that inspire them, that make them believe in something bigger than themselves. What have you created, Stephen? What's your legacy going to be, besides making people uncomfortable for cheap laughs? The personal nature of Ford's counterattack clearly struck a nerve. Colbert's face reddened as he realized his guest was no longer playing defense. My legacy? I've built a career on holding people accountable, on asking the questions that need to be asked. Just because you don't like hearing them doesn't mean they shouldn't be asked. Accountable? Ford's laugh was sharp and humorless. Is that what you call this ambush? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you invited me here just so you could take shots at me on national television. That's not journalism, Stephen. That's just bullying with better lighting. The word bullying hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be taken back. Colbert's entire demeanor shifted, his trademark smirk replaced by something much uglier. Bullying? You think this is bullying? Try being a comedian who has to watch overpaid actors complain about how hard their lives are while they collect million-dollar paychecks for reading lines someone else wrote. Ford leaned forward, his famous intensity now fully focused on his tormentor. You know what I think, Stephen? I think you're jealous. I think you're sitting there behind that desk, night after night, watching real artists create something lasting while you're stuck making jokes about whatever's trending on Twitter. Must be exhausting, constantly chasing relevance like that. The personal attack hit its mark. Colbert's composure cracked visibly as he shot back with venom. Jealous? Of what? Your wooden performances? Your complete inability to show any emotion beyond mild annoyance? At least when I fail, I fail honestly. I don't hide behind characters created by other people and pretend I'm some kind of artist. The studio audience was now completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years. Crew members stood frozen at their posts, torn between their professional duties and their obvious desire to intervene in what had become a deeply personal confrontation between two men who clearly despised each other. Ford's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting ever could. "You want to see emotion, Stephen? You want to see something real?" He paused, letting the tension build before delivering his next words with surgical precision. "I feel sorry for you. I genuinely feel sorry for someone who's so consumed with tearing others down that they've forgotten what it means to build something up." The pity in Ford's voice was more devastating than any insult could have been. Colbert visibly recoiled as if he'd been slapped. "Don't you dare sit there and patronize me. You don't know anything about me or what I've built." "I know enough," Ford replied coldly. "I know that in 30 years, people will still be watching my movies, still finding meaning in the characters I've brought to life. What will they remember about this show? Your cruelty? Your desperate need to make everyone else feel as miserable as you obviously are?" Colbert's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the bitter, angry man underneath the late-night persona. "You sanctimonious piece of—" He caught himself before completing the profanity, but the damage was done. The veneer of professional civility had been completely stripped away. Ford stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the studio floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent space. "That's enough. I've sat here and let you take your shots, but I'm done being your punching bag." His voice carried a finality that made everyone in the studio realize this interview was about to end in spectacular fashion. "Sit down, Harrison. We're not done here," Colbert demanded, his host authority completely undermined by the desperation creeping into his voice. "Oh, we're done," Ford replied with deadly calm. "We've been done since the moment you decided to ambush me instead of having an actual conversation." He began removing his microphone, each movement deliberate and final. "You know what the real tragedy is here, Stephen? You had an opportunity to have a meaningful conversation with someone who's been in this business for decades. Instead, you chose to be petty and cruel." The host made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. "You can't just walk out in the middle of a live show. This is unprofessional." Ford paused in removing his microphone, fixing Colbert with a stare that had intimidated countless directors and co-stars over the years. "Unprofessional? You want to talk about unprofessional?" His voice rose just enough to ensure every word would be heard clearly by the studio audience and millions of viewers at home. "Unprofessional is inviting someone onto your show under false pretenses. Unprofessional is using your platform to launch personal attacks instead of having actual conversations." The tension in the studio had reached a breaking point. Audience members were now openly recording with their phones, sensing that they were witnessing television history in the making. Producers in the control room were frantically debating whether to cut to commercial, but the raw drama unfolding was too compelling to interrupt. Colbert made one final, desperate play for control. "Fine, walk away. Run back to your trailer, like the prima donna everyone knows you are. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You can't handle any real criticism." Ford completed the removal of his microphone and set it down on the interview desk with deliberate care. When he looked up at Colbert, his expression contained decades of accumulated wisdom and disappointment. "Criticism? Is that what you call this character assassination? Real criticism comes from a place of understanding and respect. This," he gestured around the studio with obvious disgust, "this is just mean-spirited garbage designed to make you feel better about your own inadequacies." The final insult landed with devastating precision. Colbert's face went through a range of emotions: shock, rage, and something that might have been shame, before settling into a mask of cold fury. "Get out. Just get out of my studio." Ford smiled grimly, the expression containing no warmth whatsoever. "Gladly. But before I go, I want everyone watching to know something." He turned slightly toward the cameras, addressing the audience directly for the first time. "This show isn't being canceled because of ratings or money." The words sent a chill through the studio, as everyone realized what was about to be revealed. Ford's voice carried the weight of absolute authority as he continued, his gaze never leaving Colbert's increasingly panicked face. This show is being canceled because of how you treat people. Because the network finally realized that cruelty isn't comedy, and that destroying people for entertainment isn't what television should be about. The revelation hit the studio like a thunderbolt. Colbert's face went pale as he realized his guest had just exposed what was clearly meant to be confidential information. "You don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. The desperate edge to his denial only confirmed what Ford had just revealed. "Don't I?" Ford's smile was cold and knowing. "You think Hollywood is a big place, Stephen, but it's actually quite small. Word gets around when a host develops a reputation for ambushing guests, for making interviews so uncomfortable that publicists start warning their clients away. You think I'm the first person to walk onto this set and realize I've been set up?" The audience was hanging on every word, sensing they were witnessing not just the end of an interview, but potentially the end of an era. Camera operators continued filming despite frantic gestures from producers, knowing instinctively that this was television gold that couldn't be interrupted. Colbert made a desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative. "This is ridiculous. You're making things up because you can't handle a tough interview. The show isn't going anywhere." Ford's laugh was genuinely amused for the first time all evening. "A tough interview? Is that what you're calling this hit job? I've done tough interviews, Stephen. I've sat down with journalists who asked challenging questions about my work, my choices, my craft. That's what professionals do." His voice hardened again. "This isn't journalism. This is just you working out your personal issues on live television." The host was now visibly sweating, his carefully constructed persona crumbling in real time. "You're delusional if you think." "What I think," Ford interrupted with devastating finality, "is that you've confused being mean with being funny for so long that you've forgotten the difference. You've built your entire late-night career on making people uncomfortable, and now you're shocked that it's finally catching up with you." The truth in Ford's words was undeniable, and everyone in the studio could feel it. Crew members were nodding almost imperceptibly, their faces reflecting years of witnessing similar ambushes from their positions behind the cameras. This wasn't just about one bad interview. This was about a pattern of behavior that had apparently finally reached its breaking point. Colbert made one last desperate play, his voice rising to near shouting levels. "You can't just come on my show and destroy everything I've built. This is my studio, my audience." "Your what?" Ford's voice cut through Colbert's protest like a blade. "Your victims? Because that's all we are to you, isn't it? Just people you can tear down to make yourself feel important." He gestured toward the stunned audience. "Look around, Stephen. Look at their faces. These people didn't come here to watch you torture someone. They came here to be entertained, maybe to learn something. Instead, they got to watch you reveal exactly who you really are." The camera briefly panned across the audience, capturing expressions of shock, disappointment, and uncomfortable recognition. These weren't the faces of people enjoying themselves. These were the faces of people who had just witnessed something deeply unpleasant and were trying to process what it meant. Ford turned back to Colbert with something that might have been pity in his eyes. "You know what the really sad part is? You're actually talented. You could have built something meaningful here, created conversations that mattered. Instead, you chose to be cruel because it was easier than being good." The personal nature of the critique seemed to hit Colbert harder than any of the previous insults. His shoulders sagged slightly as the fight went out of him, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like shame. "You don't understand the pressure." "I understand pressure," Ford replied quietly. "I've been dealing with it for 40 years. The difference is, I never used that pressure as an excuse to hurt people who couldn't fight back." He paused, letting the words sink in. "That's what this is really about, isn't it? You pick on people when they're trapped in this chair, when they can't defend themselves without looking like the bad guy." The psychological insight was devastating in its accuracy. Colbert's entire interview style had been built on exploiting the inherent power imbalance between host and guest, using his position to launch attacks that guests couldn't properly respond to without appearing ungracious or difficult. Ford began walking toward the edge of the set, each step deliberate and final. "I've been in this business long enough to recognize a bully when I see one, Stephen. The only difference between you and the playground bullies I grew up with is that you've got better writers and a bigger audience." "Wait!" Colbert called out, desperation clear in his voice. "You can't just leave like this. We can start over, do this properly." Ford paused at the edge of the stage, not turning around but letting his voice carry back to the host and the audience. "Start over? With what? The respect you've already destroyed? The professional courtesy you've already abandoned?" He did turn then, fixing Colbert with one last look. "Some things can't be undone, Stephen. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt." The finality in Ford's voice left no room for argument or negotiation. Colbert sat frozen in his chair, seemingly unable to process that his guest was actually walking away on live television. The studio audience watched in stunned silence as one of Hollywood's biggest stars prepared to exit the stage. "You know what I realized sitting here tonight?" Ford continued, his voice carrying easily through the silent studio. "This show isn't really about entertainment or information or even comedy. It's about feeding your ego at other people's expense. And I'm done being food for that particular beast." With that devastating final assessment, Ford walked off the stage with the dignity and presence that had made him a movie star. The cameras followed him until he disappeared into the wings, leaving behind a studio full of stunned people and one completely devastated host. Colbert sat alone at his desk, the weight of what had just happened settling over him like a shroud. The audience remained silent, unsure how to react to what they had witnessed. This wasn't the kind of entertainment they had signed up for. This was something much rawer and more uncomfortable. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity before Colbert finally managed to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll be right back after these messages." But everyone in the studio knew there would be no coming back from this. The damage had been done, the truth had been revealed, and Harrison Ford had just delivered the most devastating critique of late-night television anyone had ever witnessed. As the studio lights dimmed and the audience filed out in uncomfortable silence, it was clear that they had witnessed something historic. The moment when one of Hollywood's most respected actors finally said, "Enough was enough." Ford's parting words about the show's cancellation hung in the air like a prophecy, and judging by Colbert's haunted expression, it was a prophecy that was about to come true. The confrontation was over, but its impact would reverberate through the entertainment industry for years to come. Ford had walked out with his dignity intact, while Colbert was left to face the consequences of his cruelty. In the end, the veteran actor had proven that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to participate in someone else's ugliness. The Late Show had just experienced its most dramatic moment ever, and it might very well have been its last.